The crack of dawn spilled across the plains of eastern Colorado like blood on a white shirt, the day Grace Porter's world shattered into 1,000 sharp-edged pieces. The telegram in her trembling hands brought news of the mining accident in Denver that had claimed her husband Franklin's life, leaving her alone with a struggling ranch and a 3-year-old son who still asked when his papa was coming home. It was 1874, 4 years after Grace had followed her ambitious husband west from Philadelphia. Franklin had promised to make his fortune in silver mining, leaving Grace to manage their small homestead outside Blackwater Springs while he pursued riches in the mountains. Each goodbye had been punctuated with the same promise: "I'll return by the first snow." But the snows had come and gone 3 times, and now he would never return at all. Grace stood on her porch, the cold November wind whipping her chestnut hair from its pins as she stared at the barren fields stretching before her. The failing crops, the mortgage notice tacked to her door, the empty pantry, all of it pressed down on her shoulders like a physical weight. "Ma." Little Joseph tugged at her skirts, his eyes wide with innocence. "When's breakfast?" Grace swallowed the lump in her throat. "Soon, sweetheart. Go wash up now." Inside, she scraped together what remained of their supplies: a handful of flour, the last of their preserved peaches, and a precious egg from their dwindling flock. It would feed Joseph for the day, but tomorrow loomed like a specter. The money Franklin had sent had dried up months ago, and the drought had withered their crops before they could be harvested. She had already sold her wedding ring to keep the bank at bay for another month. Now, with winter approaching, Grace faced an impossible choice: lose the ranch or find help. The following morning, Grace hitched their old mare to the wagon, settled Joseph beside her, and made the 14-mile journey into Blackwater Springs. The town had grown since she'd last visited, with new storefronts lining the main street and the promise of the railroad bringing a sense of prosperity that had eluded her own household. She pulled up outside Hanson's general store, lifting Joseph down from the wagon. "Stay close to me," she instructed, straightening her worn bonnet and smoothing her faded dress. The store bell jingled as they entered, and Mr. Hanson looked up from his ledger. His smile faded slightly at the sight of her. "Mrs. Porter," he nodded respectfully. "Been some time." "Mr. Hanson," Grace acknowledged, trying to maintain her dignity. "I've come to inquire about work." The storekeeper's expression shifted to discomfort. "Work, you say? Well, I don't rightly have anything suitable for a lady such as yourself." Grace squared her shoulders. "I'm not in a position to be particular, Mr. Hanson. I can clean, so cook whatever is needed." Hanson's eyes darted to little Joseph, who was staring wide-eyed at a jar of candy sticks. "I heard about your husband, madam. Terrible business. But you understand, a woman alone. Folks talk." The sting of his implication burned in her chest, but Grace maintained her composure. "My son needs to eat, Mr. Hanson. Surely the good people of Blackwater Springs would prefer I work than starve." Before Hanson could respond, the store door swung open, bringing with it a gust of cold air and the imposing figure of a man Grace had never seen before. He stood well over 6 feet, his broad shoulders filling the doorframe. Dust covered his weathered denim pants and leather vest, and his dark hat shadowed eyes that took in the scene with quiet assessment. "Pardon," he said, his voice a low rumble as he removed his hat. "Didn't mean to interrupt." "Not at all, Mr. Nash," Hanson replied, his tone shifting to one of deference. "Just finishing up here." The newcomer nodded, then turned his attention to the shelves, giving Grace and Hanson the illusion of privacy. "As I was saying, Mrs. Porter," Hanson continued in a lower voice, "I simply don't have any position to offer you. Perhaps try the boarding house. Mrs. Whitfield sometimes needs help with laundry." Grace bit back a retort. The boarding house paid pennies for back-breaking work. "Thank you for your time," she said stiffly, reaching for Joseph's hand. As they turned to leave, Joseph broke free and ran to the candy display, pressing his small hands against the glass. "Ma, look." "Joseph, we must go," Grace called, embarrassment heating her cheeks. The tall stranger looked between the child and Grace, then reached into his pocket. "Mr. Hanson, add a candy stick to my order," he said, placing coins on the counter. Hanson nodded, retrieving a red striped stick and handing it to the man, who knelt to Joseph's level. "Would you like this, young man?" Joseph looked to Grace for permission, his eyes pleading. She hesitated, pride warring with her son's happiness. "That's very kind, but we couldn't, it's just a penny's worth of sugar," the man said quietly. "No strings attached." Something in his direct gaze made Grace relent. "What do we say, Joseph?" "Thank you, mister." Joseph beamed, accepting the treat with reverence. The man smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his weathered face. "Quinn Nash," he introduced himself, rising to his full height again. "Just passing through." "Grace Porter," she replied, "and this is Joseph. Thank you for your kindness, Mr. Nash." "Quinn," he corrected. "Everyone calls me Quinn." Hanson cleared his throat. "Mr. Nash is delivering a herd to the Stockton Railway Depot over in Wyoming. One of the best cattle drivers this side of the Mississippi." Quinn shrugged off the praise. "Just a man doing a job, Mrs. Porter." Grace nodded, acutely aware of her shabby appearance beside this man who, despite his trail dust, carried himself with quiet confidence. "Well, we should be going," she said, moving toward the door. "Thank you again." "Madam," Quinn called as she reached for the handle, "I couldn't help overhearing. If you're looking for work, I might have something temporary." Grace turned, suspicion mingling with hope. "What sort of work?" "Cook for my outfit," he explained. "Lost hours to a broken leg 2 days back. Got 15 men to feed and a week's drive ahead before we reach Stockton." Hanson interjected, "Now, Mr. Nash, a respectable widow woman like Mrs. Porter couldn't possibly—" "I can do it," Grace interrupted. "I'm an excellent cook." Quinn studied her, his expression thoughtful. "It's hard work, long days, and you'd have to bring your boy along the trail, not the most comfortable arrangement." "Mr. Nash," Grace said firmly, "my alternatives are selling what little I have left or watching my son go hungry. I'll take discomfort over destitution." A slow smile spread across Quinn's face. "We leave at first light tomorrow. Pay is $20 for the week, plus meals for you and the boy." $20 was more than Grace had seen in months. It wouldn't save the ranch, but it would buy time and food. "I'll be ready," she agreed. Later that night, as Grace packed their meager belongings, doubt crept in. Was she being reckless, agreeing to join a cattle drive with a stranger? What kind of mother exposed her child to such uncertainty? But as she checked on sleeping Joseph, his cheeks still sticky from the candy, she knew she had no choice. Franklin had promised to return and had left her with nothing but memories. Now she had to make her own way. Dawn was just breaking when Grace drove her wagon to the designated meeting spot outside town. The cattle herd, nearly 500 head, spread across the valley, their lowing creating a constant backdrop of sound. Men on horseback moved among them, shouting instructions and whistling to their dogs. Quinn rode up to her wagon, looking even more imposing on his large bay gelding. "Mrs. Porter," he greeted her, tipping his hat. "Right on time." Grace nodded, suddenly aware of the enormity of what she'd agreed to. "I hope I haven't made a terrible mistake." Quinn's expression softened slightly. "My men know to treat you and your boy with respect, or they answer to me. And we've got a chuck wagon all set up for you. It ain't fancy, but it's functional." He whistled, and a weathered man rode over. "This here's Silas, my right hand. He'll show you the ropes with the chuck wagon." Silas tipped his hat, his leathery face creasing into a smile. "Madam, young sir." "Welcome aboard." Joseph waved excitedly from the wagon seat. "Are we going on an adventure, Ma?" Grace smiled despite herself. "Yes, sweetheart, a short one." Over the next few hours, Silas introduced Grace to the chuck wagon, a marvel of efficiency with its built-in storage, fold-out workspace, and supplies carefully packed to withstand the jolting journey. By mid-morning, the herd was moving north, with Grace's wagon positioned ahead to allow her time to prepare meals at stopping points. The first day passed in a blur of activity. Grace learned to cook over an open fire, managing to produce a hearty stew and biscuits that the cowhands fell upon like starving wolves. Joseph, initially shy, became the outfit's unofficial mascot, trailing after Silas and peppering him with questions. As Grace washed dishes in the creek that evening, Quinn approached, carrying a cup of coffee. The men were impressed, he said, offering her the steaming cup. Been a while since they had food that didn't taste like boot leather. Grace accepted the coffee gratefully. Thank you. Though I'm afraid tomorrow might be challenging. I've never cooked for so many while moving. You'll manage, Quinn said simply, his confidence in her abilities somehow reassuring. Your boy seems to be enjoying himself. They both looked to where Joseph sat by the fire, listening wide-eyed as one of the younger cowboys demonstrated rope tricks. He is, Grace agreed. It's been difficult for him since his father left for the mines. Even before we received word of his death, Joseph had started to forget what Franklin looked like. The words slipped out before she could stop them, and Grace felt her cheeks warm with embarrassment. I'm sorry. You don't need to hear about our troubles. Quinn was silent for a long moment, staring into the darkness beyond their camp. My pa died in a mining accident when I was 8, he finally said. In California during the gold rush, left my ma with 4 kids and not much else. I'm sorry, Grace said softly. Quinn shrugged. She did what you're doing, whatever work she could find, kept us fed, kept us together. He looked at her directly, his gaze steady. It's harder than most folks understand making your way alone. Something unspoken passed between them, a recognition of shared struggle that needed no elaboration. Well, Quinn said, breaking the moment, you should get some rest. Dawn comes early on a cattle drive. As the days passed, Grace fell into the rhythm of trail life. She learned to prepare meals while the wagon was moving, to anticipate stops, to ration supplies efficiently. The cowhands, initially awkward around a woman, soon treated her with a kind of gruff respect, always removing their hats before approaching the chuck wagon and watching their language when Joseph was near. Quinn remained somewhat of a mystery. He was unfailingly polite but maintained a certain distance, spending most of his time managing the herd and his men. Yet Grace often caught him watching her when he thought she wouldn't notice, his expression unreadable. On the 4th night, a storm rolled in from the mountains, bringing driving rain that turned the trail to mud. Grace huddled with Joseph in the wagon, listening to the thunder crash overhead and the cattle lowing nervously in the distance. Suddenly, shouting erupted from the direction of the herd. Men's voices called out in alarm, followed by the unmistakable sound of panicked cattle. Stampede. Someone yelled, and Grace's blood ran cold. She clutched Joseph closer as hoofbeats thundered past their wagon. Minutes stretched like hours as she strained to hear what was happening beyond the curtain of rain. Then the wagon door flew open and Quinn stood there, drenched and mud-spattered. You all right? He demanded, his eyes scanning them both. Grace nodded, her throat tight with fear. What's happening? Lightning spooked the herd. We've got most of them contained, but it's going to be a long night. He glanced at Joseph, who was watching wide-eyed. You stay put no matter what. Understand, be careful, Grace found herself saying. Quinn's expression softened briefly. Always am, madam. He disappeared back into the storm, leaving Grace and Joseph to wait anxiously. Eventually, Joseph fell asleep against her shoulder, but Grace remained awake, listening to the distant shouts and the gradually calming sounds of the herd. Near dawn, the storm finally passed. Grace stepped out of the wagon to find the camp in disarray, equipment scattered, men slumped exhausted by dying fires, mud everywhere. She immediately set about making coffee, knowing the cowhands would need it. She was stoking the fire when Quinn returned, looking like he'd been dragged behind a horse, his clothes torn, a cut above his eye, exhaustion etched into every line of his face. You're hurt, Grace said, abandoning the coffee to approach him. Quinn waved her concern away. Just a scratch. We lost 12 head over a ravine, but could have been worse. Sit, she commanded, pointing to a log by the fire. To her surprise, he obeyed without argument. Grace fetched water and a clean cloth from her supplies, then gently began cleaning the cut on his forehead. Quinn sat perfectly still, his eyes never leaving her face as she worked. "You didn't sleep," he observed. "Neither did you," she countered, his mouth quirked in a half-smile. "Part of the job, and this is part of mine," she replied, dabbing at the wound. "Taking care of those who need it." Quinn caught her wrist gently, stilling her movements. "Is that what I am to you? Someone who needs taking care of?" The question hung between them, laden with meaning Grace wasn't ready to examine. She carefully pulled her hand away. "Everyone needs care sometimes, Mr. Nash." "Quinn," he corrected softly. "Quinn," she conceded, turning away to hide the flush creeping up her neck. "The coffee's nearly ready." The rest of that day passed slowly as the outfit recovered from the night's exertions. Grace kept busy, preparing hearty meals and tending to minor injuries among the men. Joseph helped in his small way, carrying water and fetching supplies with solemn importance. That evening, as Joseph showed the cowhands a wooden horse Quinn had carved for him, Grace found herself watching the cattle driver from across the fire. There was a gentleness to him that belied his imposing presence, evident in how he spoke to Joseph, in the quiet authority he wielded over his men, in the careful way he'd held her wrist that morning. It had been a long time since Grace had allowed herself to notice such things about a man. Franklin had been charismatic and full of grand dreams, sweeping her off her feet with promises of adventure. Quinn was different, solid, steady, a man of few words but deliberate actions. The realization that she was comparing them disturbed her. Franklin was barely cold in his grave, if he even had one after the mine collapse. What kind of widow was she, to be noticing another man's kindness, the breadth of his shoulders, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled at her son? The next morning, Grace kept herself distant, focusing on her duties and speaking to Quinn only when necessary. If he noticed the change, he didn't comment on it, though she occasionally felt his gaze on her as she worked. By midday, they had reached a wide river crossing. The men prepared to move the cattle across, positioning themselves strategically around the herd. Quinn rode up to the chuck wagon. "This crossing can be tricky," he explained. "I'd like you and Joseph to go over first before we bring the cattle through, the water's running high from the storm." Grace nodded. "Of course, is it safe for the wagon?" "Should be," Quinn said. "I'll lead your horse myself." As they approached the river, Grace could see why Quinn was concerned. The normally placid crossing had swollen with rainwater, the current swift and churning. "Hold tight to Joseph," Quinn instructed as he took the mare's bridle. "If anything happens, focus on getting to the bank. The men will fish out any supplies that go overboard." Grace pulled Joseph onto her lap, wrapping one arm firmly around him while keeping the reins in her other hand. "We're ready." Quinn guided them into the water, his horse powerful enough to maintain its footing against the current. Water sloshed around the wagon wheels, gradually rising higher as they moved toward the center of the crossing. "Ma, I'm scared," Joseph whispered, clinging to her. "It's all right," Grace assured him, though her own heart hammered in her chest. "Mr. Nash knows what he's doing." They had nearly reached the center when disaster struck. A large branch carried by the current slammed into the mare's legs. The horse reared in panic, jerking free of Quinn's grip. The wagon lurched violently, and Grace felt the terrifying sensation of the vehicle beginning to tip. "Jump," Quinn shouted. Now, Grace didn't hesitate. Clutching Joseph to her chest, she leaped from the wagon's seat into the rushing water. The cold shock of it stole her breath as the current immediately began pulling them downstream. Joseph screamed, his small arms wrapped around her neck in a stranglehold. Grace kicked desperately, trying to keep their heads above water while fighting the pull of the river. Then strong arms were around her waist and Quinn's voice was in her ear. "I've got you. Don't fight it." Together, they let the current carry them toward the bank, Quinn's powerful strokes guiding their trajectory. When they finally reached shallow water, Grace collapsed onto the muddy shore, gasping for breath with Joseph still clutched to her chest. "Are you hurt?" Quinn demanded, kneeling beside them, water streaming from his clothes. Grace shook her head, unable to speak through chattering teeth. Joseph was sobbing quietly against her neck. Quinn scooped them both up in one fluid motion, carrying them up the bank to where several cowboys waited with blankets. "Get a fire going," he ordered. "Now." Minutes later, Grace sat wrapped in blankets beside a hastily built fire. Joseph huddled against her. The wagon had been recovered, though many supplies were lost. The mare, thankfully, had made it to shore on her own. "Everything important can be replaced," Quinn assured her as he handed them cups of hot coffee. "What matters is you're both safe." Grace looked up at him, suddenly overwhelmed by the realization of how close they had come to tragedy. "You saved our lives." Quinn shrugged uncomfortably. "Did what anyone would do." "No," Grace said firmly. "Not anyone would have risked their life for a widow and her son they'd known less than a week." Something flickered in Quinn's eyes, a vulnerability that vanished as quickly as it appeared. "We should get you both into dry clothes," he said, changing the subject. "Silas has some spare things that might fit the boy." That night, dressed in borrowed clothes too large for her frame, Grace sat beside the fire long after Joseph had fallen asleep in the repaired wagon. The events of the day kept replaying in her mind: the terror of the water, Joseph's screams, the solid strength of Quinn's arms around them. She didn't hear Quinn approach until he spoke. "You should be resting." Grace looked up, startled. "I couldn't sleep." Quinn nodded in understanding. He sat beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him, yet not so close as to be improper. "I keep thinking about what would have happened if you hadn't been there," Grace admitted quietly. "But I was," Quinn said simply. They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the flames dance. Finally, Grace gathered her courage to ask the question that had been on her mind since they'd met. "Why did you offer me this job? There must be plenty of men who could cook for your outfit." Quinn considered the question, his profile outlined in gold by the firelight. "When I saw you in that store," he said slowly, "I recognized something in you, a determination I respected. You weren't asking for charity, you were asking for a chance." He paused. "And maybe I know something about what it's like to feel responsible for others with no clear path forward." "Do you have family waiting somewhere?" Grace asked, realizing how little she knew about this man who had become so important to their survival. Quinn shook his head. "No one waiting. My mother passed 5 years back. My brothers have their own lives in California." He poked at the fire with a stick. "I've been driving cattle since I was 16, never seemed to stay in one place long enough to put down roots. Don't you get lonely?" The question slipped out before Grace could stop it. Quinn's eyes met hers across the fire, and something unspoken passed between them. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but I've made my peace with it." "I thought I had too," Grace said softly. "After Franklin left for the mines, I told myself I could manage alone, that Joseph and I didn't need anyone else." She drew the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "But today made me realize how fragile that independence is." "Needing help doesn't make you weak, Grace," Quinn said, using her given name for the first time. "It makes you human." The simple truth of his words brought unexpected tears to her eyes. Grace turned away, embarrassed by the display of emotion. "I'm sorry," she said, wiping her cheeks. "It's been a trying day." Quinn hesitated, then slowly reached out to place his hand over hers. "You don't need to apologize, not to me." The warmth of his touch spread through her like wildfire, both comforting and unsettling. Grace knew she should pull away, propriety demanded it, but she couldn't bring herself to break the connection. "We should reach Stockton by tomorrow afternoon," Quinn said, his voice pitched low so as not to disturb the sleeping camp. "You'll have your payment then, and I can arrange transport back to Blackwater Springs for you and Joseph." Reality crashed back like a bucket of cold water. Of course, this arrangement had always been temporary. In less than 24 hours, she would be heading back to her failing ranch, to the mortgage she couldn't pay, to the uncertain future that awaited them. "Yes," she managed. "Thank you." Quinn seemed to sense her distress. "What will you do when you return?" Grace shook her head. I don't know, the bank will take the ranch soon enough. I suppose we'll move into town if I can find steady work. And if you can't, the question hung between them, heavy with implications neither was ready to voice. I'll find something, Grace said with more confidence than she felt. I always do. Quinn nodded, though his expression remained troubled. Gently, he withdrew his hand from hers. You should try to sleep. Tomorrow will be another long day. As predicted, they reached Stockton by late afternoon the next day. The small Wyoming town buzzed with activity as they drove the cattle into the holding pens near the railway station. Men in suits, cattle buyers, and railway agents approached Quinn immediately, eager to complete the transaction. Grace busied herself preparing a final meal for the outfit, pushing aside the heaviness in her heart. Joseph sensed her mood and stayed close, unusually quiet as he helped arrange plates and cups. As the men sat down to eat, Quinn pulled Grace aside. I've arranged a stage for you tomorrow morning, he said, pressing an envelope into her hand. Your wages, plus a little extra for the supplies you lost at the river. Grace started to protest, but Quinn held up a hand. You earned it fair and square. The men said it's the best they've eaten on a drive in years. She accepted the envelope with a murmured thanks, unable to meet his eyes. Grace, Quinn said softly, look at me. Reluctantly, she raised her gaze to his. I've been thinking, he began, then paused, seemingly searching for words. The ranch I work for in Texas is looking for a cook for the main house. It's good pay, comfortable lodgings, safe for a boy to grow up. Hope fluttered in Grace's chest, followed immediately by suspicion. And you're suggesting this because? Because you're the finest cook I've met, Quinn said frankly. And because I think you and Joseph deserve better than uncertainty. I see, Grace said, disappointment washing through her. She had foolishly hoped for something else, something more personal. That's very thoughtful, but I couldn't possibly relocate so far from what? Quinn interrupted gently. You said yourself there's nothing keeping you in Blackwater Springs except a ranch you're about to lose. The truth of his words stung. Nevertheless, I couldn't accept a position based solely on your recommendation. It wouldn't be proper. Quinn ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in the gesture. Damn propriety, he muttered. Grace, I'm not offering you a job just to be kind. I'm offering because, he stopped, jaw clenching. Because I can't bear the thought of you and Joseph struggling alone when I could help. We're not your responsibility, Grace said, even as something inside her longed to accept. No, Quinn agreed. You're not, but maybe I want you to be. The simple admission hung in the air between them, its implications clear. Grace's heart thundered in her chest. Quinn, my husband's barely been gone. Your husband left you alone for years before he died, Quinn said bluntly. I'm not asking you to forget him. I'm asking you to consider a future where you and Joseph don't have to fight for every crumb. And what would this future look like? Grace asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Me, working as a cook while you continue driving cattle across the country, Quinn's expression softened. No. That's not what I'm proposing. Before he could elaborate, Silas approached, apologetic but insistent that Quinn was needed to finalize the cattle sale. We'll finish this conversation later, Quinn promised, his eyes holding hers for a moment longer before he turned away. But later didn't come. The cattle sale stretched into the evening, with complications that kept Quinn occupied long after Grace had fed and settled Joseph for the night. When she finally spotted him again, he was deep in conversation with the railway agent, looking weary but determined. Grace retired to the room Quinn had arranged for them at the hotel, her thoughts in turmoil. What exactly had Quinn been proposing? And why did it matter so much to her? Sleep eluded her as she stared at the ceiling, listening to Joseph's soft breathing from the bed they shared. Tomorrow they would board the stage back to Blackwater Springs, back to their precarious existence. The thought filled her with dread. Dawn came too quickly. Grace dressed and packed their few belongings, then roused Joseph for breakfast. The stage was scheduled to depart at 8 o'clock, leaving them little time to delay. They were just finishing their meal in the hotel dining room when Quinn appeared in the doorway, looking as though he hadn't slept at all. His eyes found Grace immediately, and he strode toward their table with purpose. "I need to speak with you," he said without preamble. Privately, Grace glanced at Joseph, who was contentedly eating his eggs. "Joseph, finish your breakfast. I'll be right outside the door with Mr. Nash." In the hotel corridor, Quinn wasted no time. "Don't take the stage," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Excuse me, don't go back to Blackwater Springs." Quinn took a deep breath as if steadying himself. "Come with me to Texas." Grace stared at him, speechless. "Not as a cook," Quinn clarified. "As my wife." The world seemed to tilt beneath Grace's feet. "Your wife? Quinn, we've known each other a week." "I know how it sounds," he acknowledged, running a hand through his hair. "Believe me, I've spent all night trying to find a more sensible way to say this. But the fact is, I care for you and Joseph more than I thought possible in such a short time." "This is madness," Grace whispered, though her heart raced at his words. "Is it?" Quinn challenged. "Grace, I've watched you this past week. You're strong, resourceful, kind even when you had every reason not to be, and Joseph." His voice softened. "That boy deserves a father who'll be there for him, not just in promises but in presence. And you're volunteering for the position." Grace asked, trying to maintain her composure despite the emotions swirling inside her. "Yes," Quinn said simply. "I am." Grace shook her head, overwhelmed. "I can't just— What would people think?" "People will always talk," Quinn said dismissively. "What matters is what you think, what you want." "What I want," Grace repeated, the question catching her off guard. How long had it been since anyone had asked what she wanted? "I want security for Joseph. I want to not be afraid of tomorrow." "I can give you that," Quinn promised. "I have savings, enough to buy a small place of our own." "No more cattle drives, no more wandering." He took her hand cautiously. "I've been looking for a reason to stop running. I think I've found it in you." Grace looked down at their joined hands, her mind racing. "This is too fast," she protested weakly. "Maybe," Quinn conceded. "But sometimes life doesn't give us the luxury of perfect timing. Your husband never returned, Grace. He left you to face the world alone." His fingers tightened slightly around hers. "I'm promising the opposite. I'll stay until forever feels short." The sincerity in his eyes made her breath catch. "What if it doesn't work? What if we discover we can't stand each other after a month?" A smile tugged at the corner of Quinn's mouth. "Then we'll work through it like any other challenge. I'm not promising perfection, Grace. I'm promising effort, commitment, presence." Grace closed her eyes, searching her heart for the answer. The prospect was terrifying yet exhilarating. A new beginning, a chance at happiness she'd thought forever lost. "Joseph has to agree," she said finally, opening her eyes. "If he's uncomfortable with this in any way, of course," Quinn nodded. "He comes first." They returned to the dining room where Joseph was attempting to build a tower with the salt and pepper shakers. He looked up as they approached, his face brightening at the sight of Quinn. "Mr. Nash." "Did you come to say goodbye?" Quinn knelt beside Joseph's chair, bringing himself to the boy's eye level. "Actually, Joseph, I came to ask you and your ma a very important question." He glanced up at Grace, who nodded encouragement. "How would you feel if I asked your ma to marry me and we all went to live in Texas together?" Joseph's eyes widened. "Like a new pa, something like that," Quinn said carefully. "If that would be all right with you." Joseph considered this with all the seriousness a 3-year-old could muster. "Would you teach me to ride a horse? A real one, not a pony," Quinn smiled. "When you're a bit bigger, yes." "And would you go away like my other pa did?" The question pierced Grace's heart. Quinn's expression grew solemn. "No, Joseph, I wouldn't go away. I'd be there every morning when you wake up and every night when you go to sleep. That's a promise." Joseph nodded, apparently satisfied. "Then it's all right with me." Quinn looked up at Grace, hope written plainly across his features. "And you?" Standing there in the Stockton Hotel dining room, with morning sunlight streaming through the windows and her son watching expectantly, Grace made her decision. Life had taught her harsh lessons about promises and dreams, about the fragility of plans and the cruelty of fate. but it had also shown her the importance of seizing chances when they appeared. "Yes," she said softly, "it's all right with me too." Quinn's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, gradual, then brilliant. He rose to his feet and, mindful of their public setting, took her hand and pressed it gently to his lips. "I'll make you both proud," he promised. Every day. 1 month later, in a small church in San Antonio, Grace Porter became Grace Nash. Joseph stood proudly beside them, holding the rings on a small cushion sewn by the rancher's wife who had welcomed them with open arms. As they exchanged vows, Grace looked into Quinn's steady gaze and felt, for the first time in years, that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Not because fate had led her here, but because she had chosen this path, this man, this future. Later, as they danced under lantern light in the ranch courtyard, Quinn pulled her close and whispered in her ear, "Happy." Grace looked around at their new home, at Joseph playing with the rancher's children, at the community that had embraced them so readily. Then she looked at Quinn, her husband, her partner, her unexpected blessing. "Yes," she whispered back, rising on tiptoes to brush her lips against his. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Quinn's arms tightened around her. "Good," he said softly, "because I meant what I said. I'm staying till forever feels too short." And in the years that followed through the birth of their twins 2 years later, through droughts and prosperity, through all the ordinary joys and sorrows of family life, Quinn Nash kept that promise. Where Franklin Porter had chased elusive fortunes and left only absence in his wake, Quinn built something more valuable. A legacy of presence, of steadfast love, of a life truly shared. For Grace, who had once measured her days by losses, it was the greatest wealth imaginable.